Welcome to our first RILE lecture series for our winter quarter. I am Professor of Science Education, Brian Brown, and I'm honored to serve this year as the chair of the Department for Race, Inequality, Language, and Education here at Stanford's Graduate School of Education. Today, we come to you with a mixture of excitement and disappointment. Our original goal was to meet in person, while live streaming this event to really start this year off right, building culture to share the research of one of our newest and most cherished colleagues, Dr. Alfredo Artiles. Unfortunately, COVID health concerns have changed our plans, and so we shifted to this online venue again. However, we invite you to join us throughout this quarter as we hear from scholars across the nation, including our own GSE researchers and scholars. Before we get started today, I want to thank our team of Terrence Turner, Coco Massengale, and Kendra Shabalmaheen for their incredible efforts to coordinate the event throughout this quarter. Thank you for your efforts. Before we get started today, I really want to take a moment to introduce our speaker. In contemporary schools, differently abled students are assessed by teachers and specialists. The work of scholars like Dr. Artiles causes us to question who prepares these people to make the vital decisions about the future of our young people, and then how are these subsequent decisions shaping the lives of students beyond their schooling years. So Dr. Artiles' work suggests that the overrepresentation of Latino and African American students is rooted in a confluence of issues. These issues are political, they are racial, they are language-based, all leading to issues of inequality across the context of color and disability. His work challenges the notion that the current system is working. And it suggests that we engage in a critical rethinking of the way that we label our young people and how those labels impact their future. Dr. Artiles is the Lee Jacks Professor of Education. His programmatic work engages in the questions of how education inequality remedies create injustices and what are effective ways to reduce these challenges. His scholarship examines the dual nature of disability as an object of protection and a tool for stratification. More specifically, he aims to understand how do the responses to disability in the intersection with race and social class and language advance or hinder educational opportunities for groups of students from disparate backgrounds. He's thinking critically about the culture and historical context of racial disparities, special education, and whether a disability diagnosis is associated with differential consequences for minoritized groups. We are honored that you are a part of our professorship here at Stanford, and we're privileged to have you. So join me in welcoming Professor Alfredo Artiles.
Good morning, Brian. Thank you so much. Gracias for your kind introduction. I am grateful for the invitation to participate in the RILE Speaker Series. And like you, I would like to also recognize Coco Massengale, Kendra Shabalmaheen, I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, and of course, Terry Turner, for their support in organizing the event. I was really blessed to have their assistance and guidance. And I also, like you, hope that we'll have opportunities soon to meet in person for this speaker series, despite the ever-evolving challenges we face with the pandemic. I hope everyone and your families are staying well and safe during this difficult time. I will focus today on disability and its intersections. I worked on these issues for at least 30 years in multiple cultural and national contexts, spanning 3 continents. And I started as a special education teacher and administrator and eventually shifted to doing research. And these experiences have led me to conclude that it is urgent that we advance our understanding of disability in an increasingly heterogeneous world fraught with inequalities. I focus today on the wicked problem of racial disparities in disability identification. This is indeed a puzzling equity challenge that the education field has grappled with for over 5 decades. 2 National Academy of Sciences reports have been published since 1982. Federal legislation has been approved to monitor and address this predicament. Multiple studies have been released, especially in the last 20 years. Technical assistance centers and initiatives have been advanced. Yet the problem persists, and it seems that recent discourse surrounding this problem is increasingly polarized. I argue that a major difficulty with this problem is the way it's been framed by some researchers. which tends to oversimplify the profound complexities of disability intersections with other markers of difference. So I'm going to switch to share my screen so you can see my slides. And I'm going to switch to show mode. Is that okay? Is that looking good? Can somebody give me a thumbs up?
You're good.
All right. So for this purpose, then I will focus on the racialization of disability. And I hope to refine our understanding of racial inequality and develop responses to reduce them. The bottom line for me actually is to avoid dehumanizing those whom we were seeking to represent in our research by acknowledging the social, the historical, the cultural context of these individuals. I'm inspired by Adrian Rich's insights on the politics of location. And therefore, I assume that people occupy locations in hierarchies we create and that bring consequences to their lives. This is actually a critical consideration, as we know, particularly if we work with underserved and oppressed communities. I think that a significant challenge we face as researchers is how to reconcile the complex realities of people's lives with the demands of certain research approaches that tend to compel us to ignore these circumstances and report our analysis as if, following Renato Rosaldo, we're projecting a view from nowhere. This is a crucial reminder of the moral dimension of research. And so my goal today is twofold. I would like to challenge all of you to take a critical look at the traditional research on a long-standing educational equity problem, namely the racialization of disability, and second, advance a vision for new kinds of scholarship. Now, if we think about students with disabilities, we've come a long way since 1975 when the federal legislation was passed. We have grown in terms of the coverage. About 14% of all students now have disabilities and are being served in the system, ages 3 to 21. About a third of them have learning disabilities. That's the largest disability category. And we have made huge advances in making programs more inclusive. As you can see, about 90% of students are now enrolled in regular schools in K through 12. And about 2/3 of the students with disabilities spend over 80% of their time in general education classrooms. So these are really striking advances, and we made a lot of progress. The actual legislation offers, as you can see here, a list of principles of IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, offering a number of protections and entitlements to these individuals. This population has fought hard for rights, for access to education. They were discriminated for a long time. And so it is a welcome development to have this system in place to protect the needs and the rights of students with disabilities. However, as we look at the research, we see that these protections and safeguards are not necessarily being experienced by students across racial groups in the same way. Let's take, for example, segregation. Even though I just shared with you those very impressive numbers, we know from research that African Americans learners are placed in more segregated settings than white students with the same disability diagnosis. We also know that when it comes to having related services that enrich the experiences of students in other areas, occupational therapy, speech pathology, et cetera, African American students receive fewer related services than their white peers with the same diagnosis. Oftentimes we hear discussions about whether the problem is racial differences versus poverty, since it's so pervasive in communities of color. And there is interesting insights from research showing that Black and Hispanic low-income students are more likely to be identified for special education compared to their low-income white peers. And the problem of this problem also crosses over second language issues, and is an interesting case of how second language or language differences might be becoming racialized in this context. We know, for example, from research that my colleagues and I did a number of years ago, that English learners were more likely to be identified for in low poverty schools, in schools that were affluent. So as you can see, the problem of racial disparities in special ed highlights one of the most intractable paradoxes of justice in the education field. How is it that something that was a remedy for an injustice, a special education, become an index of inequality for other marginalized groups? This is indeed a fascinating paradox that's at the heart of racial disparities in disability identification. and that we have failed to address. I would like to challenge everyone to consider these racial disparities as more than broken kids and families of color or biased school staff. I urge you to consider a more complex explanation of this longstanding equity problem in which history, systems of oppression, ideologies, and cultural practices play key roles. And for this purpose, then, I will make the case for a new stance in the study of racial disparities. Nasir, Bang, and Yoshikawa recently identified signs that our society is on the cusp of a paradigmatic shift toward educational equity. They reminded us that we're living in a moment of possibility, that we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Just as we are enduring unprecedented challenges due to a pandemic and growing racial and economic inequalities, we cannot afford to revert to a normal that will reaffirm historical injustices. As Nasir and her colleagues argued, we have the opportunity to imagine possible futures, new kinds of scholarship about racial disparities in disability identification. The ideas that I share with you today are inspired by this promise of possibility. I propose an alternative framing based on a perspective that engages with complexity and that accounts for cultural historical influences. I start by recognizing, and this is an interesting point, that disability is in a way a universal notion. Indeed, disability touches the lives of all human beings in one way or another during our lifetimes. It is not surprising, therefore, that most societies deploy protections and supports for people with disabilities. But just as disability constitutes an object of protection, it is necessary to remember that disability can also be used as a tool of stratification. This is most clearly observed in contexts in which disability intersects with other markers of difference, such as race, language, social class, and gender. And this is often done by segregating individuals with disabilities or limiting educational opportunities through curricular choices or reducing access to related services, as I show you in those research findings. And herein lies the challenge for the research community. To paraphrase Ruha Benjamin's argument made in the context of algorithmic justice, how, by whom, under what conditions, and to what ends is disability used as an object of protection or a tool of stratification? Iris Young reminded us that a theory of justice must be mindful of both end states or outcomes, as well as the antecedent processes shaping unjust end states. Racial disparities are outcomes emerging in an unjust educational landscape. What we have largely neglected to study are the complex cultural historical processes that shape racial disparities in these identification rates. Recent research has been systematically disregarding the role of some of these issues. Give me 1 second, I'm just flipping through my notes here. And unfortunately, this line of research is framed oftentimes with a binary logic. Are racial disparities due to child deficits produced by poverty and negative family cultures, or are they due to intentional bias of teachers and staff? Building on Harris's critique of traditional racial analysis, recent work assumes that disability diagnoses across races are the result of neutral sorting and choice, more of a technical framing of the problem. The problem with this perspective is that it embraces the epistemological stance described as the view from nowhere that I alluded to a moment ago. Now, the problem with this is also that the recent research has been systematically disregarding the role of race and bias in disability disparities. For instance, in a recent research review, these authors concluded that their synthesis yielded no evidence that Black children's overrepresentation in special education was explained by systemic bias. I should note that the view of bias in this work is limited on at least 2 counts. It is reduced to intentional acts of individuals, and it erases the role of historical and structural factors. Borrowing again from Benjamin, this work misconstrues racism for race. The former is a function of power and inequality, whereas the latter is purportedly grounded in biology and culture. By focusing on the inherent qualities of groups, whether residing in genes or values, the analyst loses sight of the larger context in which those differences are conjured in the first place. Now, Regarding the second quote, although the phrase otherwise similar that is used here is widely used in the research communities to index statistical procedures used to control for background factors, it is necessary to raise a critical consideration about this statement. If we consider the historical trajectories and lived experiences of racial groups in the US, including racial segregation, income inequality, other deep sociocultural differences, what do we lose when we assume that, borrowing from Collins and her colleagues, a white boy and a black boy only differ in terms of race? Now, a troubling development in this line of research is the biological reinscription of race. For instance, researchers are now pointing to biological and other risk factors among students of color. And in this way, exposure to these so-called risk factors are naturalized in the experiences of people of color, thus perpetuating a deficit trope and supporting the narrative that race and racism are insignificant. It is unsettling that this deficit thesis has received so much attention from researchers and the popular media. I argue this line of research is being used to reproduce what I describe as ideology ontology circuits, in which researchers, policy stakeholders, and professionals normalize what philosopher Iris Young described as end state patterns, such as health threats and disability and achievement rates, to support a view of students of color as inherently broken, damaged. I build on Cheryl Harris's work on frames to conceptualize ideology ontology circuits. She describes frames as pre-existing ideological systems of ideas or scripts that inscribe meaning into facts. Frames are embedded in cognition and are triggered and shaped by social situations and experiences. Now, color blindness or color evasiveness play a key role in creating ideology ontology circuits because this ideology naturalizes racial inequality. And critically significant, it often reduces injustice and discrimination to the actions of individual actors. The next move in this logic is to scapegoat culture. That is to assume that inequality is the product of culturally deficient bodies. Therefore, people deploy color evasiveness and deficit thinking to frame natural patterns of inequality as inherent features of communities of color. In this way, we witness the move from ideology to ontology. To borrow from Fine and Ruggles, these circuits tattoo the material and psychic scars of lack onto most Black, Latinx, immigrant, and or poor students. In this way, ideology ontology circuits forge a vision of the damaged nature of students of color's bodies and lead individuals to conclude that racial inequality will only disappear when brown and Black people are fixed. I'm concerned about the emergence of ideology ontology circuits in research about disability-race intersections, particularly as I see and hear what Nasir and her colleagues call racial storylines, the images, assumptions, and stereotypes of brown, Black, and other people of color circulating in schools and society as not ready, unable, violent, lazy. I'm also concerned that some emerging research on racial disparities is seemingly intent in limiting the significance of racism. It seems to subscribe to the stance that was critiqued and in sociological research by Bonilla Silva and Bayoki a few years ago, that endorses the idea of anything but racism. Thus, my work has been concerned with advancing a critical cultural historical model to explain racial disparities and inequalities that situates this research in the larger socio-historical and economic history of dispossession, opportunity gaps, and education debt that have affected communities of color. I'm also committed to historicize disability-race intersections and acknowledge structural mechanisms that create racial inequalities and trace how cognitive and institutional processes reproduce these inequalities in local context by blaming students of color. For example, since at least one way in which we have historicized this work is to recall and remind the research community that since at least the 19th century, public health and other disciplines, including medicine, psychology, and education, have engaged with the notion of race in problematic ways, oftentimes with ethical consequences. Public health scholar Nancy Krieger documented that racial categories became so entrenched and naturalized in scientific thought that by the early to mid 19th century, medical discussions about populations and research on their health status without racial categories became virtually unimaginable. For this reason, comparative research can be problematic if we're not aware of these historical and ideological legacies. This is not a technical problem only. Therefore, I argue we must rely on a historical intersectional frame to study racial disparities in disability identification. The structural dimension of intersectionality is reflected in Doug Baden's reminder that, quote, not only has it been considered justifiable to treat disabled people unequally, but the concept of disability has been used to justify discrimination against other groups by attributing disability to them. A historical imagination in research will enable us to understand how disability can be used to discriminate and stratify. And I will argue historicizing this work will assist us to understand how, by whom, under what conditions, and to what ends is disability used as an object of protection or a tool of stratification. We recently conducted a large study informed by some of the assumptions I've outlined so far. We intentionally avoided the binary framing of studies that I critiqued earlier about the existence of disproportionality. Most of the studies in this literature are quantitative and many lack clear theoretical frameworks. Thus, it is not uncommon to read quantitative findings based on large data sets that render multiple, often unexplained interactions or unclear underlying mechanisms. Thus, we wanted to examine how school personnel explain disproportionality and attempt to comply with equity-oriented policy requirements, issues that have been neglected in this literature. And so we did a study in 2 suburban school districts in the Northeast. I'm going to share with you on one of those studies that we are now have a paper under review. And the state in which we did the work, the state guidelines, after receiving an initial citation for disproportionality, prescribed that school districts were required to undergo a self-directed compliance review of their policies, practices, and procedures as they related to the nature of the citation, whether it was because of identification in special education by race or racial disparities in discipline. If a district remained above the state's determined numerical threshold for racial disparities for more than 3 years, or if they were non-compliant with IDEA mandates, the state will intervene and actively monitor district actions and responses. If a district was cited and then recited within a short time period, the state offers supplementary professional development and technical assistance services to the districts and continue to monitor compliance with IDEA mandates regarding significant disproportionality. Therefore, we posited educators working in districts with fluctuating histories of at least 3 citations, experienced taking actions and responding to their citations, and could describe their local processes to address the citations. This was a suburban, let me go back. We worked then at this suburban district. It had, in the state, to give you an idea, about 40% of suburban districts were cited. And about half of those received multiple citations. We targeted a district we are calling Lakeview that was cited 3 times in the previous 10 years for both disability identification and discipline. They struggle with racial disproportionality in identifying Black students with disabilities and discipline, both with and without disabilities, particularly African Americans. While white students comprise approximately 75% of the district, they made up slightly less than 60% of students receiving in-school and out-of-school suspensions. In contrast, Black students comprise about 15%, 1/5 of the district, yet made up just about 40% of students receiving those suspensions. Similar discipline disparities existed for students with disabilities. Now, Lakeview historically had been a high-achieving district. It had multiple offerings around sports and extracurricular activities. It was ranked in the top 10 of the schools in the region. It was a relatively small school district of about 3,000 students. It had 2 elementary schools, Morning Star and Holbrook are the pseudonyms, as well as 1 middle school and 1 high school. They had experienced declining enrollment in recent past, mostly white students, and English learners and students of colors increased over time in the district. Holbrook Elementary border one of the top ranked school districts in the state, whereas Morningstar border Center City that had urban districts. The neighboring Center City was among the largest and more economically segregated in the state. High rates of unemployment, poor housing quality, and lack of other essential resources. It ranked last among districts in the region. We spent about 18 months in, collecting data. We did mostly in-depth interviews with administrators, teachers, and students. We also collected a significant amount of materials and documents. We did participant observations and conducted one focus group with students that had a majority of students of color. And as we looked at the data, we heard over and over from district administrators and teachers, like Lakeview and this whole district is like a family. So in some respect, there was considerable bonding, that is group connectedness, and it's particularly among white residents. But we also learned that there was weak internal bridging to other racial and linguistic groups in the district that will broaden that notion of being a family. A small number of staff were concerned about white teachers and leaders' lack of understanding of race and culture. For instance, a staff member reflected how this lack of understanding, quote, sends a big message to students of color. Students of color might ask, am I not worthy? Why can I see myself in the teaching team? Do my teachers really care about me? We found that a history of special segregation by race and income reinforced and exacerbated inequalities and opportunities for students throughout the district. The formation as a district was deeply tied to historic patterns of white flight from Center City. After World War II, Center City experienced an increase in the number of Black residents due to growth of jobs in the region. And the result was a growing Black population that was forced to live in segregated neighborhoods while white residents fled to the suburbs, including Lakeview. And this contributed to hyper-segregation in the community. Now, these historical socio-demographic and special transformations contributed to racial and income segregation that produced racialized differences and inequalities for students throughout the district, as you can see from the quote in this slide. So space played a significant role in creating opportunity structures, and they were evident at the neighborhood level as reflected in different socioeconomic and racial configurations. For instance, bordering the majority Black community of Center City, the principal of Morningstar described how perceptions of the school's composition created a dual housing system and thus a dual education system in the district, as you can see in this quote. The primary rationale for halting integration efforts that had been tried in the past was to allow students to attend their neighborhood school or community school so they could continue walking to their elementary school rather than having to drive across the district, which would have taken 10 minutes. District leaders and white families legitimized in this way racial, economic, and special segregation by co-opting the discourse of inclusive education with its emphasis on the right to attend neighborhood schools that we see around policy and research circles. Thus, the structuring of special inequalities at the school and neighborhood levels naturalize racialized differences. The resulting hierarchies from this form of recognition were associated with the distribution of resources. The housing sector was a piece of this puzzle. 2 subsidized housing apartments and university housing near Morningstar were discussed as distinctive features of the housing near Morningstar, compared to Holbrook, an area described as having $1 million homes. The principal of Morningstar described how housing shaped perceptions of the 2 elementary schools and the need to constantly combat the perception of her school not being academically strong. And she went on to explain, realtors will say to parents, let's go, move over to Holbrook, let's not go to Morningstar. So we can see how some of these discourses permeated other areas. And so this distribution of opportunities that were largely special and cultural, as well as segregation, had a number of consequences, particularly around resources, as you can see in this list of items, in terms of access to first-year teachers, PTA resources that provide a significant complements to teachers in the affluent schools, the concentration of students of color and students with disabilities in certain schools like Morningstar, enrollment in AP. And these findings, as we ponder this evidence, made visible the intertwining of temporal and spatial legacies, how history and space and other practices we describe in this paper as defect craft contributed to racial, linguistic, and ability segregation and educational inequalities. As we talk to staff and leaders about how they explain the persistence of citations, they had 3 in those 10-year period. Their explanations reflected a hierarchy of group categories and offered justification for segregation and naturalized disproportionality. Specifically, many staff believed that the citation was a result of families from neighboring urban communities moving into Lakeview, what was described as a challenge given their status as the first-ring suburb of a major city. On the one hand, diversity was considered and touted as an asset in the district, but at the same time created the need for significant adjustments, particularly an adjustment of expectations, as you can see in this quote. This idea of mismatching expectations was a significant argument made by a number of district leaders and teachers, and it was blamed on students of color not keeping up the expectations of the district. Many educators rely on deficit perspectives as they try to make sense of the citations. For instance, a high school special education teacher rationalized the disproportionality citations as the product of academically challenged schools in Center City, where families were looking for something more for their kids. The teacher went on to connect geography to ability by explaining what you see on this quote. And so the work of what we call defect craft is reflected in the teacher's othering language. They will come into our classes, as well as the construction of student identities through specialized considerations and a deficit discourse. When explaining the recurrent citation, staff consistently targeted city center students and their families. They assemble spatial and cultural historical factors to craft deficit-laden student academic identities and problematic family cultures. And so deep-seated cultural archetypes of Black students and their families were used to consolidate defect craft's work. These processes affirm deficit assumptions about the nature of this racial group and its traits, particularly with regard to the ability level of Center City students, or by invoking tropes of lack of character and respect from the students. And so through these rhetorical moves, Lakeview shaped inequitable special opportunity structures in Center City schools. I should say that we also found instances in our data in which these ideas and practices around defect craft were disrupted, but they constituted a minority of the views we documented in the district. Race neutrality was another key theme in the staff explanations of disproportionality. A middle school administrator, for example, discussed the disproportionality citation related to school discipline by saying, are people being prejudicial in the way they write people up? Is that subgroup just more likely to misbehave? I try not to focus on that, to be honest with you. I handle it as a school disciplinarian. I'm charged with handling the referrals that are sent my way. I pride myself on handling all referrals that are sent my way and holding every student accountable to our code of conduct, but also treating every student as an individual. While the administrator did not speak explicitly about race, he implicitly conveyed not seeing race in his equal treatment philosophy. Further, he legitimized the inequality in school disciplinary practices by holding every student accountable to our code of conduct. In another instance, a special education teacher from Holbrook legitimized the citations by saying, The one person this year that has spent 2 lunch periods in the principal's office for not completion of homework, you get 3 warnings and then you have to go and do it during lunch, is Black. I mean, that's just, it is what it is. This teacher used the school policies and rules to legitimize the practice of sending a Black student to the principal's office without interrogating why, or whether there were other practices to support the student, particularly given the challenges the district faced with citations for disproportionality and school discipline. These illustrations of defect-craft processes show how race was made invisible by saying, hold every student accountable, as well as visible. The person that spent lunch periods in the principal's office is Black, to explain disproportionality, while racism was pushed backstage. Now, how did they respond to these citations? We approached the work using what we describe as a processual perspective. Such perspective draws attention to the space between the formal dimension of organizations, like monitoring rules and procedures, and everyday enactments in practice. And federal legislation, IDEA, required districts to use 15% of funds from their coordinated early intervention services to address disproportionality. And Lakeview, the district, used these funds primarily for what they call cultural responsive training. And as you can see, the focus was on improving teacher practices, raise awareness about racial disparities, build community trust, pursue systemic changes. They also had some other things going on. They had support from a local TA center, a regional TA center. They hired a consultant to do a 3-day training. They had a partner, a university partner, to implement with the training, as well as a few other things that you see at the bottom of the slide. But consistently, staff and leaders describe cultural responsive training as the cornerstone initiative in responding to these citations. Now, cultural responsive training, what was missing there in all of this effort was an interrogation of institutional racism and ableism, broadly speaking, and an examination of the struggles the district faced regarding disproportionality in identification and discipline policies and practices more specifically. There was strong support, don't get me wrong, from administrators for this training, and many staff embraced the training. For example, a special ed high school teacher shared, this effort that we've made has made a big difference because I think people are just more aware and more sensitive to what they're doing, and that it isn't necessarily the kids. When everybody thinks that there is something wrong with the kid, and really there is something wrong with you, she said. However, there were significant limitations in the way this work was done. This was a yearly training for about 20 teachers out of 300. The initial selection targeted staff that, quote, could benefit from the training. However, it was later decided to make it voluntary due to negative feedback from some staff and administrators. Additional professional development was offered to teachers, but our analysis of district and school documents suggested these trainings were largely race neutral. These efforts focused on behavioral interventions, creating safe schools, and how to engage in alternatives to suspension, but race was not explicitly featured or engaged. And so this way, leaders and the district, however well-meaning, created symbolic legal structures that serve as visible indicia of attention to the law, which offer legitimacy benefits to the district. The structures allow for compliance in form without requiring much substantive change to the workplace environment. Thus, the equity goals of IDEA regulations were diluted as the district built in discretion or rules to evade the managerial responses purportedly created to comply with the policy. And so the emphasis on cultural responsive training suggested the solution was to fix deficit-laden identities, that is, prejudice staff, living and examine how their newly gained abstract understandings of personal racial bias connected with institutional considerations related to opportunity to learn, to referral processes, behavioral assessments, and assumptions of those assessments and norms, and critically significant lack of consideration of a past of racial and socioeconomic tensions in the community and the district. Overall, the district's responses to the citations were unclear and hesitant. A staff member described this work by saying, I think we talk the talk, but we don't walk the walk. And so these are the assertions that we crafted after looking at this data. They are far away from the binary thinking that we are seeing in research, asking, do we have bias in these practices? Is there a disproportionality or not? Is it white students that are disproportionately placed versus students of color? We're trying to advance an understanding and a set of insights that will allow us to understand the complexities of the problem. And so the assertions show that we need to look at the aftermath of some of these issues. Once we determine that there is a disproportionality problem, how do people make sense? And a way of understanding this is by looking at their understandings, explanations, and responses in the context of cultural, historical, and social special considerations of those districts and communities. We also found that those explanations, as they tried to make sense of what was happening in the district, were often grounded in this damaged imagery. And oftentimes those responses, due to, in part, the ambiguity of policy mandates, constituted mostly symbolic gestures that signal compliance. And so overall, the findings paint a significantly more complex perspective on the problem of racial disparities in special education. Particularly, we documented the dual nature of disability by accounting for the role of historical legacies, cultural and special practices, and the persisting stratified impact of race. This is the beginning of a series of studies we're doing. We have a second study that we published recently this past summer in Sociology of Education, connected to this larger project that was funded by W.T. Grant Foundation. There are a number of consequences. I'm going to leave this up so that we can look at them, and maybe during the conversation, we can refer to them. This is not by any means an exhaustive list of potential responses or plans to continue this work, but they hopefully will inspire some good conversation. I appreciate your patience, and I hope that the large amount of information I shared with you made some sense, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Brian, back to you.
Let me first say that I am honored to call you a colleague. This has been an incredible presentation. Give me 1 second. I want to make sure that we do need to change one thing on the slides. Give me a second. Thank you. So, and moving forward, we're going to shift now to Q&A. And so we have a lot of questions. People are sending in questions. They want your slides. They want a copy of the video. And so we'll have this video hosted. Just to be clear, the purpose of our RILE conversations is to share research in a consumable way. And so it will be hosted on our website for you to use. So I want to start, Dr. Artiles, we're talking about this intersection between race, poverty, language, and policy. A lot of times we talk about disability, but rarely do we talk specifically about how these things intersect. So can you talk just a little bit more about how socioeconomic status, the wealth of a student intersects with race and disability? How does that matter in our modern educational system?
Right. You know, one of the risks that I see emerging in discussions about intersectionality is that we inadvertently may end up approaching the discussions about intersectionality as individual markers of identity. And so we say race, class, language, and we oftentimes, not everybody, but it happens regularly in many circles, leave out the historical and structural aspects of intersectionality. And so when we say, I'm going to do intersectional analysis of race and disability, all we tend to do oftentimes is to stick to the analysis of those markers without connecting it to those broader legacies, the way we try to do in this paper, by showing that this is not a new occurrence. This is not new. It has been happening since the 60s around racial tensions and inequalities and access to resources. So for me, the attention to the history, the context in which this is evolving, the fact that oftentimes people invoke assumptions and project images mostly negative images of communities of color, is all part of that consideration. Otherwise, we're just reinforcing the same analysis that we have seen in many fields, that we end up blaming kids and families, particularly families of color, for all of these patterns. And what is interesting is that I find some researchers now co-opting this whole discourse about social justice by saying it is only just, it is only equitable that because they lack so much, because they have missed so much, we need to give them our interventions that tend to be completely decontextualized, colorblind, not acknowledging those broader issues in communities. And so we have to be very careful and mindful. And I don't mean to say that all of these developments are intentional. Oftentimes they can be. But I think the challenge for us is to account for the complexities of these historical trajectories. And the role of space in this study was huge. We tend to under-theorize space. And we have seen a change, fortunately, in the last 20 years. And so with urban geography and cultural geography informing our work in education, but I think we need to do more of that. This doesn't deny that there are inequitable distribution of opportunity. It doesn't deny that there is a sizable percentage of people of color living in poverty. But that's just an indicator. It's just the flag that we need to begin to understand and examine in that broader context. How much of that lag in achievement is a result of not having access to opportunities, as opposed to just blame the kid for not being ready? I mean, I have a lot of issues with the idea of being ready and risk factors because it blames the kids consistently. So I'm going to stop here because I don't want to.
Beautiful, beautiful answer. And something I experienced as a teacher, right? High school teachers blame the middle school teachers who blame the elementary school teachers who blame the preschool teachers. Is like, well, the accountability for preparing the kids is something really, really powerful. Now, there's been a couple specific requests, and I think there's a ivory tower theory to practice thing that's happening. One of those questions is, how do we have access to your work? How do we follow your work specifically? But before we answer that, I want you to answer generally, how do we make sure that the research you're doing speaks directly or finds its way into schools and policymakers? So can you answer that question first? Then I have a follow-up question about your specific work.
Right. That has been a challenge for all of us in education research. How do we make our work relevant and how do we make it actionable? We see more attention now to what is described as knowledge mobilization. I led with colleagues about 15 years ago a national center to provide technical assistance. And so we started to do that work, and that's one means to use regional labs and technical assistance centers to begin to engage. The problem is that those initiatives are often framed in a very didactic, traditional pedagogical perspective that is all about, here is the content, use it, and if you use it, you're going to be okay, without acknowledging the huge disparities and inequalities that exist in districts and schools that are beyond the control of teachers. I mean, I also refuse to say it's all the fault of teachers. They're only actors in very complex systems. But those resources are critical. We are wrapping up a consensus panel report with the National Academies of Sciences on the future of the Institute of Educational Sciences. I just got the reviews from the external reviewers on our draft yesterday. And in that vision for the next 20 years, IES is turning 20 years this year. We were appointed as a committee to look at the future. One of the big ideas in this new vision that we're proposing to the field is precisely your point, Brian. How do we develop strategies systematically to fund research that is asking this question? Can we engage faculty and researchers and people doing this work to think about the mobilization of the knowledge, to make it accessible, to work with practitioners in systematic ways? It's not a requirement, but it's a significant advancement, I think. So I think the beginning of the answer is to question our epistemologies and ask, are we the only ones with the truth? Are we the only ones who can say this? And can we begin to frame the questions and the findings reporting in ways that are meaningful to people who are using it? And that means there is a whole science of knowledge mobilization. NIH is doing fascinating work on implementation science, for example, in medicine. We need to account for the fact that knowledge travels across different boundaries in very complex ways and oftentimes unpredictable ways. We need to think, what does that mean? And one of the ideas is that we're proposing to study the very process of knowledge mobilization. What do we need to understand and anticipate when you produce your research findings as practitioners and leaders that are involved in so many complex demands begin to make sense of that on top of everything else that they're trying to deal with. So there is a theory of organizational change and professional learning behind those things. So those are just some of the beginning ideas that I have. I'm happy to elaborate on that offline. And you will see that report coming out is expected to be released in February.
One of the things that we can do is make your work available to our RILE listserv. So those of you joining us today, if you join our RILE mailing list, we can send out the new work from Dr. Artiles as well as social media links so you can access his work directly. So I do want to shift to a question about context. In particular, Lynn Somerville asked us, can you speak or have you seen different rates of disproportionality between states? So not specifically on a national level, but are certain states doing a better job at making these assessments and serving their students equitably than others?
There is significant variability between states and within states. And that speaks to the complexity. And to ask the question, do we have disproportionality, is an unfair question because it erases all of that complexity. So I think part of that is, on the one hand, there is the policy is ambiguous. For example, the federal policy doesn't prescribe the threshold that you need to use to determine when a pattern is disproportionate. That is left to states to decide. Do you need to see 200% representation of certain groups to call it disproportionality, 300%? And when you look around the country, you see a significant variability in terms of those patterns. And I'm looking for a slide here to show you examples of those of that variability, because it's stunning to see how states are gaming the system by changing the thresholds of disproportionality. I'm looking for that. So that's one factor. The ambiguity of the policy is shaping this variability. The second one is the lack of clarity. Districts are moving up and down that threshold. The third consideration is the very specific historical context of the district and how they address. It's different to look at data in the South, where you have a relatively recent influx of English learners in the last 15, 20 years compared to places like California. You might find a configuration of disproportionality different for English learners in certain places due to their recent arrival, due to lack of understanding of professionals in looking at these issues, racial tensions, how language has been racialized in some sectors and is happening increasingly at the national level. So I think we have to consider all of those factors to begin to make sense of these differences. Here it is. Let me see if I can show you. Can you see that?
Yes.
So at the top in blue, you have the threshold. How disproportionate do you have to be considered disproportionate? And you see that some states say, well, it has to be twice as likely. But you have other states that require 3.5 or more. Now, it's not enough to have that threshold. At the bottom, you have how many years you have to show that pattern. So sometimes getting that number 1 year, you're in trouble, you get cited. Other states say, well, you can get a 3.5, but you need to show that pattern 3 years in a row before you get cited. Now, part of the problem here, so that gives you a sense of what I was referring to a minute ago. The problem is that we are treating this as the main problem, the numbers game. And to me, this is only a symptom of broader, deeper issues that need to be examined and transformed. Because what happened is, if you make it the problem, you game the system and you can lower the numbers without changing much. And that's happening already.
Excellent. We're going to close with one final question. First of all, I always find it amazing when they ask you a question, you have a slide prepared to answer that question. So you're setting the bar really high. So thank you for that. the final question. We have a lot of teachers and administrators in our audience today. I see teachers as community leaders and administrators as community leaders who will be teaching their local communities about race, language, culture, and differently abled students. What recommendations would you have for those teachers and administrators for how they might approach this to prepare their school to do a better job?
I think there is a strong emphasis these days in the research community that is rewarding to me to see increasing importance to have partnerships between researchers and professionals. I think creating opportunities in schools to form partnerships or inquiry approaches to examine your own practice is a good first step, because in that context, you begin to question foundational ideas like what is learning? What counts as competence? How is the curriculum reflecting and nurturing and honoring the communities represented in the school? Do we understand what are the implications of the assumptions we make about assessing proficiency in literacy or in math? Those are basic questions that we can begin to bring to those contexts of professional learning. Now, this is not an individual decision that a professional can make on his or her own, because as we know, there are very specific organizational features in schools that constrain pursuing these things. So whatever effort we make to bring inquiry into our work as practitioners or professionals have to be done in tandem with a discussion with leadership of the school to create conditions, scheduling-wise, space-wise, fiscal-wise, to support this kind of practice. It represents a shift. And there are good examples of that. There are good examples of people doing this work. There are significant literature reviews showing this work. Bill Penwell is one example of work. Cynthia Carburn has been doing a lot of this work over the years. And what is interesting to ask is what is missing in those bodies of work? How is race engaged in those examples? And in some cases it is, in others it's done less explicitly. But we have enough knowledge to begin to build on those experiences and in those insights. So I think that will be the very first recommendation. And second is to question the way we think and engage with families, particularly families of color, particularly communities that are underserved. Are there ways in which we can revise and reaffirm the critical importance of honoring what these individuals bring, despite them not meeting our assumptions of what is a good parent, and stopping to think that just because you didn't show up to a conference, it doesn't mean that you don't care about your kids' education, that there are other larger structural issues shaping oftentimes these things. So that's a big question. These are just some beginning leads into that conversation.
Excellent. Well, I thank you, Dr. Artiles, for an incredible talk. We hope this is one of many conversations with and engagement with your work. And so, as I mentioned before, we'll not only send this video out, but we'll share new research from Dr. Artiles to this community so you can learn more. The rest of our calendar for this quarter looks like this. February 3rd, I will be presenting research on language, cognition, and science teaching. I should have known better. I should have went first. And so Dr. Artiles has set the bar really high, followed by the one and the only, the incredible Deanne Charity Hudley, which is February 10th. And then Wonderful. We're going to have a panel on Indigenous education, March 3rd, including Terry McCarthy, Tiffany Lee, and Mary Hermes. So incredible slate. Looking forward to having everyone join us. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all again. Have a great rest of your day.
Take care.